When Yeshua gathered with his disciples that evening, the air carried both peace and tension. The city was alive with pilgrims preparing for Passover, lamps flickering through narrow streets, families readying the lamb, the herbs, and the unleavened bread. It was the appointed time, the remembrance of freedom. When Israel recalled how Yahweh broke the power of Egypt and called his people into covenant. At that table, Yeshua was not creating a new ritual. He was stepping into the oldest covenant act given to his people. Everything about that night spoke of faithfulness. The lamb on the table, the bread without leaven, the cups of wine, the songs of deliverance. Each part reminded them that Yahweh had kept his promise. He took the bread, blessed it, and broke it. And he said, "This is my body given for you." These were not mystical words. In Hebrew thought, the bread symbolized life offered in obedience. He was saying, "Remember me through the life I have lived in faithfulness to the covenant. Do what I have done. Walk as I have walked." Then he lifted the cup. The deep red wine shimmered in the firelight. He said, "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many." His disciples knew those words. They came from the mountain where Moses sealed the covenant with Israel, sprinkling the blood and saying, "Behold the blood of the covenant, which Yahweh has made with you." Yeshua was placing himself inside that same pattern, not replacing it, but fulfilling it. He was about to give his life as the faithful servant who obeys unto death. The cup was not a new mystery. It was the continuation of Yahweh's ancient promise. The covenant would stand forever through faithfulness, not through philosophy. Can you see it? The Passover table was never about inventing a religion. It was the heartbeat of relationship, Yahweh with his people. A covenant remembered generation after generation. When the meal was over, they sang the psalms of praise, the Hallel, just as every family did on that night of remembrance. Then they walked out into the night toward the Mount of Olives. What was ancient had been renewed. What was shadow had found its light. But history would not leave it untouched. As the years went by, another voice began to shape how the nations would remember that evening. A man named Paul, a Roman citizen from Tarsus, trained under the famous Gamaliel, a man who understood both the Torah and the philosophies of Greece. He claimed to serve the same master, yet the language he used began to turn the covenant meal into something else. When he wrote to the assemblies of the Gentiles, he described what he called the Lord's Supper. He said he had received it from the Lord, that on the night he was betrayed, the Lord took bread and said, "This is my body," and the cup likewise. But the meaning was shifting. The Passover of Yeshua's covenant was becoming a ritual of death remembrance. The rhythm of obedience and freedom was turning into a mystical symbol of salvation through belief alone. Paul was no stranger to the world he spoke to. He knew the Greco-Roman mind. He knew that in their temples, sacred meals and wine offerings represented union with their gods. He knew that words like participation in the body and blood would sound to Gentile ears like mystical initiation. Yet he used them anyway. Think about that for a moment. A man trained in the Torah, one who claimed to know the law and the prophets, spoke to a world shaped by pagan mysteries and deliberately used their language to redefine the covenant meal. This was not misunderstanding, it was strategy. Paul's gospel was designed for Rome. Paul's letters began circulating among the assemblies. The more they spread, the more his version of the meal replaced the one Yeshua shared. His instructions to the Corinthians fixed the form, bread, cup, and warning. He said that whoever ate or drank unworthily was guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. In that single statement, the meal became less about remembrance of obedience and more about guilt and fear. The covenant of joy turned into a ritual of examination. The family table of Yahweh became an altar of anxiety. Paul wrote as a man of dual worlds. He could speak the Hebrew tongue of covenant, but he also carried the reasoning of Greece and the rites of Rome. He was not an outsider to their world. He was born into it. A citizen of the empire, fluent in its thought, aware of how symbols moved hearts. When he spoke of participation in the body and blood, he was not naive. He knew that in the pagan temples, Worshippers ate sacred meals, believing they joined their gods through those offerings. He knew that the Gentiles he wrote to would hear his words through that same mystical filter. And yet, he pressed forward. Can you see what that means? This was not confusion. This was construction. A deliberate blending of Hebrew story with Greco-Roman mystery. Paul's message did not simply drift, it was steered. He was molding a faith that Rome could understand and eventually adopt. Yahweh's covenant was built on obedience. Every feast, every command, every act was relational. An agreement between Creator and people confirmed by faithfulness. But Paul's system shifted the foundation. He taught that the law brought death, that the flesh could never be justified by works, that belief alone was the new path. The covenant became a testament, a legal will where inheritance was received, not a living agreement where obedience was required. The Greek word used for testament also meant a will, something written by the dying to divide an estate. In the Hebrew world, a covenant meant partnership and shared life. But in the Greek world, a testament meant possession transferred at death. Do you hear the shift? One is about ongoing faithfulness. The other is about receiving a gift. Paul's gospel, wrapped in Greek words, replaced covenant partnership with testament inheritance. He wrote that Yeshua became the mediator of a New Testament. Those words changed the story. Yahweh had never abandoned his covenant. He renewed it through Yeshua, but Paul reframed it as new. A fresh legal document that rendered the old void. The people no longer saw themselves as covenant partners. They saw themselves as beneficiaries of a divine will. And so language did its work. Over time, the Hebrew rhythm of covenant was forgotten. Communities gathered to break bread not as an act of covenant remembrance, but as a ritual of salvation. They no longer saw the bread as symbol of obedience, but as the literal presence of divinity. They no longer heard the cup as covenant promise, but as mystical union. Paul's influence spread quickly because it fit perfectly into the Roman mind. A simple, repeatable ritual, a universal formula. Bread, wine, words, and faith. All controllable, all exportable across an empire. The covenant of Yahweh had been personal, intimate, tied to obedience and community. The New Testament of Paul was institutional, transferable, and soon to be imperial. Think about how effective that was. Within a century, leaders like Ignatius and Justin Martyr were writing about the Eucharist, the Thanksgiving meal where bread and wine were no longer symbols, but sacred matter. They quoted Paul more than they quoted Yeshua. His letters became the framework, his definitions the standard. As the church took shape under Roman favor, Paul's language became law. The gatherings that once mirrored the Hebrew Passover became ceremonies led by priests. The bread shrank to a thin wafer. The cup was raised in ritual words. And the story of Exodus, the great liberation that Passover proclaimed, faded into distant memory. By the time of Emperor Constantine, the shift was complete. The faith born in the hills of Judea was absorbed into the empire. The Council of Nicaea and others that followed declared uniform creeds, not covenants. They defined belief statements, not faithfulness to Torah. And at the center of their worship stood Paul's reinterpreted meal. Now an altar service, a mystery performed by clergy for the people. Later centuries went even further. Philosophers in the Latin West debated how the bread and wine could actually become body and blood. They used Aristotle's categories of substance and form to explain a mystery that Yeshua never spoke of. The result was the doctrine of transubstantiation, the claim that the bread truly becomes flesh, the wine truly becomes blood. It was no longer a covenant sign, but a miracle to be adored. And all of it could trace its line back to the words Paul chose, the language he imported, and the Greco-Roman lens he allowed to define the faith. He knew the power of empire and the minds of the Gentiles. He bridged the gap deliberately, and in doing so, he built the foundation for a faith that could thrive in Rome but forget Jerusalem. Can you see how deep that goes? The message of Yeshua was never about establishing a new system. It was about restoring what Yahweh had given from the beginning covenant relationship. Every word Yeshua spoke, every parable, every healing pointed back to the covenant promises. Love Yahweh, love your neighbor, keep his instructions, walk in truth. That is what he meant when he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." Remember the covenant. Remember the life that fulfills it. Remember what it looks like to live faithfully before the Father. But Paul's message changed the center. It was no longer about the Father's covenant. It was about the Son's death. The focus moved from obedience to belief, from faithfulness to forgiveness, from covenant renewal to personal salvation. It was subtle, but it was enough to redirect the entire path of the faith. Marcion, in the 2nd century, took Paul's thought even further. He rejected the Hebrew scriptures completely, calling the God of Israel a lesser being. For him, Paul's message was pure freedom from the law, freedom from the old God, freedom from anything Hebrew. Though the church condemned Marcion, it never fully removed his influence, because it had already accepted Paul's framework. The Torah was still sidelined, and the idea of a New Testament remained. Over the centuries, the divide between covenant and testament grew. The Hebrew understanding of covenant living agreement sealed in obedience was replaced with the Greco-Roman idea of testament, legal inheritance sealed in death. Yahweh's ongoing relationship was rewritten as a transaction completed once for all. Now, think about this. Everything Yahweh instituted was covenantal. Creation itself was covenant. The Sabbath was covenant. The rainbow with Noah, the promise to Abraham, the words to Moses, all covenant. Even Yeshua's own words were covenant. But the church, guided by Paul's narrative, built a theology on testaments, on contracts closed by death, not on living relationships renewed by obedience. And from that foundation came a religion that looks upward but not inward, that celebrates the death but forgets the life, that preaches grace but neglects covenant faithfulness. Yet even within that system, the echo of truth has never died. The matzah still whispers of the haste of deliverance. The cup still carries the color of sacrifice. The memory still calls to those who listen. Deep down, the heart of covenant still beats beneath the layers of ritual and philosophy. The question is, will we hear it? When Yeshua said, "If you love me, keep my commandments," he was calling his followers back to covenant. When he said, "I have not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it," he was reaffirming Yahweh's eternal agreement. His life was not an end to Torah, but the perfect example of how to live it. The bread he broke symbolized that obedience. The cup he lifted sealed that example. So, can you see how tragic it is that his covenant meal became a mystical sacrament? That the remembrance of obedience became a ritual of consumption? That the meal of deliverance became the altar of dependency? It is time to see it for what it is. Paul's influence was not an accident. It was a crafted message shaped by a man who understood both the Torah and the empire. He built a bridge, but it was a bridge away from covenant toward control. His words gave Rome a version of faith. It could manage a religion, it could institutionalize. And through him, the simple covenant table of Yeshua became the universal sacrament of the church. But Yahweh has never changed. His covenant still stands. His commandments still bring life. His desire has always been relationship, not religion. When we return to that night in Jerusalem and see Yeshua with his disciples breaking bread and lifting the cup, we see not a church ritual but a covenant renewal. It is the moment when the ancient promise of deliverance met the living faithfulness of the Son. It is the night when obedience and love became one. So let this truth settle deep. The covenant was never replaced. It was reaffirmed. The law was never abolished. It was fulfilled through faithfulness. The table was never meant to be an altar. It was meant to be a place of remembrance, of unity, of renewed commitment to live in Yahweh's ways. If we can see this again, the power of that night returns. The bread becomes a reminder of life offered in obedience. The cup becomes the call to walk faithfully in the covenant. The song of Hallel becomes our song of deliverance. And as we remember, not through ritual but through revelation, the covenant lives again in us. So pause for a moment and let your heart consider. Do we want the testament of men or the covenant of Yahweh? Do we want ritual comfort or living obedience? The choice is still before every heart. Return to the covenant. Live by it. Let it shape every act, every word, every choice. For this is what Yeshua lived and died to restore, not a religion of Rome, but a people of covenant. Let this be the remembrance we keep. Let this be the bread we break and the cup we share. The covenant renewed, not replaced. The life remembered, not the death idolized. And as we walk in that truth, may the world once again see the light of Yahweh through his people, faithful, obedient, and alive in the covenant he promised forever.